In the last episode, we discussed what ocean acidification is. In this episode, we're going to be covering some basics about the coral reefs, why they're important, some threats against them, and the effect of losing them. Corals are actually animals. They are a species of polyps, which are very simple animals that consist of a stomach and a single tentacle. They use this tentacle to kill and eat tiny organisms known as plankton. Each of these corals secrete a substance called calcium carbonate that over time builds up and causes these corals to stick together and form a colony. These colonies consist of thousands and thousands of corals stuck together. In total, coral reefs take up less than 1% of the ocean floor. Coral reefs are some of the most diverse ecosystems in the world. They are home to tens of thousands of species. For example, the coral reefs of the Florida Keys are home to 45,000 stony coral species, 27 soft coral species, as well as 5 species of turtles, 500 species of fish, 1,700 species of mollusks, and hundreds of sponges. Coral reefs are pretty picky about their growing conditions. They prefer a temperature range between 23 and 29 degrees Celsius, or 77 to 84 degrees Fahrenheit. They are found in clear, shallow waters of less than 150 feet deep. Access to sunlight is a requirement for corals because they have a symbiotic relationship with photosynthetic algae. These reefs do have some natural predators, and some species do feed on the corals themselves, but the greatest threat to reefs is rising carbon dioxide levels. As oceans absorb more and more carbon dioxide, more heat is trapped. Ocean temperatures have been rising by about 0.1 degrees Celsius or 0.18 degrees Fahrenheit every decade. This may not sound like much, but marine ecosystems are very sensitive, and each year ocean temperatures are rising. Remember that the reefs require an optimal temperature range of 23 to 29 degrees Celsius or 77 to 84 degrees Fahrenheit. If temperatures increase beyond this range, the reefs respond by bleaching. Coral bleaching occurs when reefs lose their algal pigmentation. Typically, if the bleaching episode is mild and short, the corals are able to recover when algae recolonize. However, if bleaching lasts for too long, the corals may starve to death.
Although climate change is a major threat to coral reefs, humans are also responsible for a lot of the current damage. Many fishermen are overfishing fish that the corals depend on. For example, many of these fish eat seaweed that grow on the coral. Without these fish, the seaweed would grow out of control and would suffocate the coral. If this keeps up, it could lead to the death of the coral and collapse of the reef. Everyone loves a nice beachside resort, but coastal construction and development often hurt coral reefs by leaking runoff into the ocean. Some of this runoff contains sediment that clouds up the water above the corals. If you remember, corals are dependent on clear water, so their algae can absorb sunlight and produce food for them. If this cloudy water persists, the corals can't get enough sunlight and the algae cannot produce food. Sometimes this runoff also includes fertilizers. These fertilizers are perfect food for floating algae, and when they find a patch of it, they rapidly multiply. Although algae are essential for the biodiversity of the coral reef, too much of a good thing can end up being bad. The algae end up consuming a majority of the oxygen in the water and make it difficult for fish and other species around the reef to live.
As you heard in the last episode, ocean acidification has become a big problem. This is especially true for the coral reefs. As carbon dioxide levels increase, this causes the ocean pH to drop or become more acidic. The biodiversity of the reefs are negatively impacted by this. When the ocean becomes too acidic, some key species that are vital to keeping the coral reef colony healthy are eliminated. These species cannot stand to survive in an environment that becomes too acidic too quickly. Although the coral reefs depend on surrounding species to remain healthy, those species also rely on healthy coral reef to survive. The loss of them would be detrimental to the overall ecosystem of the ocean. Here are some species that the Earth stand to lose if we lose the coral reefs. The first one are butterfly fish. Butterfly fish, as you can see in the picture, are these really, really pretty yellow fish. These guys play a pretty big role in the coral reef ecosystem by preventing algae from aggregating and smothering the coral. Also, their diets consist of exclusively coral. If the coral reefs are to go, then these butterfly fish can no longer eat.
Spiny lobsters would also be in trouble if coral reefs were to disappear. These creatures rely on the reef for shelter and protection, especially when they're molting. When they molt, they shed their old, smaller exoskeleton and begin to grow a new one. As you can imagine, when these lobsters lose their exoskeleton, they are very vulnerable. They rely on the reef for protection while they're regrowing their own. They also help the coral reefs by eating sea urchins, which can be a big problem in big numbers. Whales and dolphins are probably some of the world's most beloved animals. But how can they be hurt by the loss of coral reefs? Contrary to popular belief, whales and dolphins would be at a great loss. They rely on eating fish who use the coral reef for food and protection. The loss of coral reefs would create a deadly domino effect, which would work its way up the food chain and seriously affect dolphins and whales. Lastly, sea turtles also rely on the coral reef for their food source. They are highly dependent on eating the sponge species that reside within the reef. They also contribute by balancing food webs and many other habitats, and taking nutrients from sea to land. If the coral reefs were lost, the whole ocean would feel the blow.